Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, welcome back. Thank you for all your prayers. We did something, let me say this before we start too. I think with all, how do I say this? With all assurity, we will probably be doing a lot more of what we did last week before Christ returns. What I mean is this, is that when James had his condition, we thought maybe he had a heart attack or a stroke, and we were waiting for the paramedics to come. The brethren got together, and we huddled, held hands, and prayed together. Alex and Letty had already did that with the group right at his side, right outside. It is very similar. These are conditions that are not the norm where people are getting up by show, one-upsmanship kind of thing. These are actual dire needs that are very important for the life of God's people. And I believe God looks down. And the reason I say with all surety that as conditions continue to worsen, the brethren are going to be drawn more and more into prayer to help one another. I think you all agree to that. We see that in the book of Acts when Peter was in jail. They were all in one room praying. When God let him out, Peter comes running to the door, knocks on the door, and said, "Let me in." And he said, "No, that can't be Peter. He's in jail." But they were praying to get him out. He was at the door and they wouldn't let him in. I'm trying to get this where it don't have that popping noise. All right, before I begin the sermon, these are some more of those thoughts. Thought-provocative, some are humorous, but most of them just get you in the mood to think a second. I have learned to ignore the facts does not change the facts. To ignore the facts doesn't change the facts. Put them on the lapel over here. Like that? Okay. I've learned that when you plan to get even with someone, you are only letting the person continue to hurt you. You find that's true? You agonize and agonize and agonize. That's what God says, vengeance is His. I've learned that love, not time, heals all wounds. I like that. Love heals all wounds. The easiest way for me to grow as a person is to surround myself with people smarter than I am. That goes against human nature. It really does. You want to get around people where you feel superior? The yes men, they get around them. I've learned that everyone you meet deserves to be greeted with a smile. I've learned that opportunities are never lost. Someone else takes the ones you miss. That's true, huh? See, I just read that myself and said, wow, that's true. You don't take advantage of something, somebody else will. I've learned that when you harbor bitterness, happiness will dock elsewhere. I thought about that this morning when I was reading this. I said, I can picture you, there's the dock, and there's a ship. It's called bitterness. And happiness can't dock because there's no room for it. So it goes to another harbor. And the last one, I want to end with this one because I love this one. I like to laugh. I have learned that no matter how serious your life requires you to be, everyone needs a friend to act goofy with. Isn't that true? You got to have somebody you can be goofy with, you know. We're in the book of Acts, chapter 13. God had set apart the Apostle Paul and Barnabas to do a work. They had called for the elders. They had called for the prophets, which was kind of interesting that we find in the book of Acts that there are prophets still on the scene long after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. People think, well, the prophets are gone. Prophets are done away with. The prophets are something in the Old Testament. But here we read in Acts 13, verse 1, now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers. We're having a teacher seminar tomorrow night, phone conference for those who will be speaking at the feast to help build better teachers within our church to be able to be more profitable in serving God's people. Wouldn't it be interesting one day when God sets forth and says, we're going to have a prophets meeting? How would you know that? Really be really hard to say. There was Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, and who had been brought up with Herod, the Tetrarch, and Saul. And as they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, Separate me, Barnabas and Saul, which is Paul, for the work unto which I have called them. You and I have been called to do a certain kind of work, no different than we see the separation here of Saul and Barnabas. And so begins the work by Saul and Barnabas, teamed up together, and they're going out to do the work. And you'll see from verses 6 through verse 13, I won't take the time to read here, make a little note if you're taking notes, to go back and see that immediately following the call and the separation, Satan is involved in trying to destroy the work that God began. If you look back in your life, you probably see at the same time you felt a calling to understand God's truth, while at the same time your life began to go through some horrendous problems, trials, and difficulties. And that is because Satan knows the work that God is doing in you, and he can recognize that work. And as soon as God calls, separates you aside, say, this is one of my chosen vessels, and make no mistake, if God has called you, you are a chosen vessel set apart for God for a holy purpose. We seem to forget that. We seem to think we just go through the motions of going to church. You forget that when God called us, we have been brought into a work. It is an end-time work to prophesy, to warn, to make witness, and to prepare a people to be ready for the return of Jesus Christ. Satan knows that, and he wants to destroy the work that God has begun in you. And you can go through and you can read how this has been taking place immediately after God is separated. Now I want to pick up the story in verse 14. But when they departed from Pergia, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and they went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, now what people don't understand today is that, well, you're supposed to read the law and the prophets because that's what they did in the Old Testament, that's what they did in the New Testament. Well, there was a particular reason they would do this. The people did not have Bibles in their homes. The only way they could understand what was going on was when they went to synagogue, or if there were studies by the Levites or the priest. There was no other way for them to hear the laws of God. So every week when they would go in, it would be their custom. And that's what it was. It wasn't the law, it was a custom. They would sit down, the priest would stand up, and he would read from the law and he would read from the prophets. And so they went into the synagogue and they sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, saying, You men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. And from that time on, then it would be turned over in order, one or two, and at the most, we could read in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul's instructed them, at the most 3 people, and then in course. It wasn't at one time. It wasn't by what we're looking at today as a Pentecostal type movement where everybody in the building is jumping up and down, saying things and discussing, and nobody's listening to one another. It wasn't that way. It was one in course and by order. Paul stands up, verse 16. It says, let me pick it up in verse 15. It says, You men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. So Paul stands up, and you can see him. Now try to picture what's written here. Paul stands up and beckoning with his hands. You can see the fervency in what he's about to say. He's reaching the people. He's motioning with his hands. He's about to tell them an important message. He beckons with his hands. You can see him. Men of Israel, and you that fear God. Now, if there were any Gentiles in the audience, there's nobody left out now. Unless there was a non-believer, and why would he be there? He continues to talk now from this point on. He stood up, motions with his hand, You men of Israel, and you that fear God, listen. And I hope whoever gets this tape will listen to what's got to be said here today. When you think about the news of the week that we just went through, I'm going to talk about a little bit of that today. I haven't talked about prophecy in a long time, but from time to time we just must do it. It's a part of our work. It's a part of the witness of what we must do. And just like Paul was telling them here, This world needs hope. And the only way to do it is to talk about what it's going through to give them hope when Jesus Christ returns. So Paul now begins and he says, listen. He's got a captive audience. The God of the people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people who dwelt as sojourners in the land of Egypt with an high arm, and he brought them out of it. Now he begins by bringing them through the history of where they got to on that very day when he was beckoning to them, when he told them to listen. It was about the time of 40 years that he bore their manners, or he put up with them. He said, for 40 years, God bore them. He listened to their griping, their moaning, their complaining. I wonder how many times God looks at us as we go through our lives. And we gripe every day about something that we don't like. We gripe about, and we talk about the heat. I was talking about the heat earlier. And I do that every day because, as you know, I run that steam equipment. I'm doing my carpet cleaning. You go into a building, it's 110 degrees sometimes. 120 degrees when you go upstairs in the second loft. No ventilation, no air. And you're running steam at 220 degrees. By the time you walk out, you're soaking wet. And you say, oh, man. You didn't have to go back and pick all your equipment up and thank God for the work that He's given to you. How many times do we gripe about maybe the car not working right? Maybe the children aren't working right. Well, the children in Israel for 40 years, God says, I'm sick of listening to you gripe. And you look back and you recount the history where God says, when I had you for those 40 years, He says, you lack nothing. And I thought about when God says that, and you can go back and recount when Moses was telling them the history, and he said they lacked nothing. And I thought about the first time I heard that, it's like, wow, they're in a desert. They ate manna every single day. There wasn't any air conditioning. Sometimes they didn't have water, and they griped about that. Sometimes they wanted meat, and God gave meat and ate, and some of them died because they overate. And you wonder about how in the world are we going to get through what God has for us today. It says that God bore their manners in the wilderness for 40 years. And when He destroyed the 7 nations into the land of Canaan, He divided the land by lot. And after that He gave unto them judges for the space of about 450 years. I'm going to cover a little bit in the Judges. I'm going to cover a story toward the end of this sermon today about what happened in the book of Judges and show you how today is very similar to the time in the book of Judges. How man does what is right in their own eyes. As we go through this message today. And afterwards they desired a king. It wasn't good enough to be ruled by God Almighty. They wanted a king. They wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted to be able to fit in. And God warned them, you don't want a king. But they said, no, we want a king. And He warned all the things that was going to happen to them. And then when He had removed, He raised up unto let me back in verse 21. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. And when He removed him, He raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also He gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, who shall fulfill all mine will. Remarkable story now as the throne is now being established on earth. Very similar to what Jesus Christ would have, whose will was to fulfill the will of His Father. Jesus said, not my will, but thine will be done. And to establish the throne that would be last forever would have to have a type of the Jesus Christ to sit on that seat. And David fulfilled that very requirement. Now Saul's going through this with all these people sitting in this audience. He's building up to a point. He's trying to tell them where they were today. Where are we today? If we looked at prophecy today, where are we?